July 1981. In a corner of the county that maps had long since learned to summarize with a simple patch of green, the rain did not stop. It was not a violent rain, not the kind that tore at shingles or turned creeks into brown torrents. It was a soft, persistent, ruinous rain. It fell with the quiet determination of a glacier, a slow-moving disaster that measured its progress in inches of soil saturation and lost days. For the farmers of the Piedmont, it was the summer the sky sagged. Silas Blackwood felt the rain in the timbers of his house. He was 71 years old, and the farm had been in his family since the land was granted, not sold. He lived in the house his great-grandfather had built, a simple two-story structure of heart pine and fieldstone that had settled into the landscape like a native tree. It stood on a gentle rise, overlooking the fields that were both his inheritance and his life's work. He was a man shaped by the same forces that shaped the land around him: sun, work, time, and the slow pressure of seasons. He was lean, the way old tools are lean, with no part of him that was not for a purpose. His hands were maps of his labor, the lines and calluses a record of fences mended, engines repaired, and harvests brought in. He moved with a quiet economy, a man who had learned early that wasted motion was a tax on the body that was always collected. The problem was the hay. It was the first cutting, the most important. It was the rich mix of orchard grass, timothy, and the deep-rooted alfalfa his father had insisted on planting 60 years prior. It stood thick and tall in the bottom fields, the heads heavy and nodding under the daily weight of water. By the 1st of June, it had been ready, the clover just beginning to bloom, the grasses at their peak of protein. A perfect week of dry, sun-drenched weather was all that was needed. 3 days to cut and cure, a day to rake and bale, and a day to get into the barn. The almanac had promised such a week. The sky had ignored it. Now, deep into July, the hay was overmature. The nutritional value was dropping with every passing day, the stems growing tough and woody. But the greater danger was the moisture. To bale hay, it had to be dry, under 20% moisture content. That was the rule, inviolable. Baling wet hay was not just a waste. It was an invitation to catastrophe. Damp hay, packed tight into a bale, would begin to decompose. Bacteria would generate heat, a slow, inexorable cooking in the heart of the stack. The temperature would rise until one hot, still afternoon, the hay would reach its flashpoint. Spontaneous combustion. A barn, a year's worth of feed, a lifetime of work, could vanish in a pillar of smoke and flame. Silas had seen it happen twice in his life on neighboring farms. This was not a new problem in the region, only a particularly stubborn iteration. Men had always fought the rain. In 1957, a wet spell had cost his neighbor, Thomas Caldwell, his entire herd. Caldwell had tried to wait it out, and by the time it was dry enough to cut, the hay was little more than straw. His cows grew thin over the winter, and he had to sell them off at a loss in the spring. In 1968, another wet June had prompted a half-dozen farmers to try a new chemical drying agent sprayed from a crop duster. It had cost a fortune and had left a bitter taste in the hay that the cows refused. The men who had paid for the service were still paying for the feed they had to buy to replace it. The community had a long memory for such failures. They had come to accept a wet summer as a kind of biblical plague, an act of God against which there was no appeal, only endurance. The common wisdom was to wait, to pray, and if prayer failed, to take your loss and hope for a better second cutting. A new kind of wisdom had arrived in the county that spring. It came in the form of a young man named Mark Renshaw, the new county extension agent. Renshaw was a recent graduate of the state's agricultural university. He was energetic, confident, and he carried the authority of scientific data like a shield. He drove a new white Ford pickup with the county seal on the door, and he was never without a stainless steel clipboard and a pocket full of soil sample bags. He believed that every farming problem had a modern, efficient, and quantifiable solution. Renshaw held a meeting at the co-op in the first week of July. The place was packed. The air was thick with the smell of damp denim, fertilizer, and anxiety. Farmers who usually spoke only of weather and prices now listened with rapt attention as Renshaw stood before them, next to a slide projector. He spoke of moisture meters, of new hybrid grasses that tolerated damp conditions, of chemical preservatives that could be sprayed on the hay as it was baled. He showed them charts and graphs, regression analyses, and cost-benefit projections. "The old ways of waiting and guessing are over," he declared, his voice ringing with the certainty of a man who has read all the latest journals. "We have the technology now to manage risk, to control our outcomes." Silas stood at the back of the room, near the towering stacks of feed sacks. He listened without expression. When Renshaw began to talk about the preservatives, a mix of propionic and acetic acids, Silas could smell the faint, sharp odor of the stuff on a pamphlet being passed around. The agent explained that the chemicals would inhibit mold growth, allowing a farmer to bale hay at a much higher moisture content, as high as 25%. The cost was significant, requiring a special applicator rig on the baler and several $100s in chemicals per cutting. After the presentation, Renshaw took questions. One farmer, a man named Henderson whose land bordered Silas's, asked about the safety. "Perfectly safe," Renshaw assured him. "The acid dissipates. It's been thoroughly tested." Another asked about the cost. Renshaw clicked to a new slide. "When you factor in a near-certain loss of your crop without it," he said, "it's not a cost. It's an investment." He saw Silas at the back, a relic in denim overalls and a faded seed corn cap. "Mr. Blackwood," Renshaw said, pointing a friendly finger, "you've been farming this land longer than any of us. What do you think of these new methods?" The room grew quiet. They all knew Silas. They knew his ways. He considered the question for a long moment. "Hay's got to be dry," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's the beginning and the end of it." Renshaw smiled, a patient, condescending smile. "Well, that's the traditional view, of course. But science has given us new tools. We don't have to be bound by the old limitations." He turned back to the crowd. "The point is, trying to bale in this weather without an agent is just asking for trouble. Your hay will mold. It will heat. It's a total loss." He looked back at Silas. "You'd be better off letting it rot in the field." Silas gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and slipped out the door before the meeting was over. He had heard enough. The talk at the feed store counter the next morning was all about Renshaw. "That boy's sharp," said Henderson, stirring his coffee with a bolt. "He's got the numbers to back it up. I'm thinking about getting one of them sprayers," another man chimed in. "Cheaper than buying hay all winter." They looked over at Silas, who was paying for a block of salt and a new set of point for his tractor's distributor. "What about you, Silas?" Henderson asked a little too loud. "You gonna get scientific on us?" Silas pocketed his change. "Got my own way," he said and walked out. A low chuckle followed him. "His own way," someone muttered. "That means he's gonna do what his daddy did, and his daddy before him. Probably got a special prayer," he says over the field. The laughter was not unkind, but it was dismissive. It was the sound of a world moving on, leaving a man behind. They saw him as a stubborn old man, a living piece of history, respectable but no longer relevant. They pitied him for the loss they were sure he was about to suffer. That evening, Silas sat on his porch, watching the mist settle in the low spots of his fields. The rain had paused, but the air was heavy with the promise of more. He was not thinking about Mark Renshaw or the men at the co-op. He was thinking about the summer of 1948. He had been a boy of 18, strong and full of the certainty that his father's ways were old-fashioned. The rain had been just as bad that year. His father, Abram Blackwood, had been a man of even fewer words than Silas, a man who communicated through action and the quiet turning of a problem in his mind. He remembered standing with his father at the edge of the same field, the hay thick and ready. "It'll never dry, Pa," Silas had said, frustrated. "We're going to lose it all." His father had not looked at the sky. He had looked at the hay. He had pulled a stalk of orchard grass, split the stem with his thumbnail, and felt the moisture within. He had tasted it. "There's a window," Abram had said. "It won't be the one we want, but it'll be the one we get." For 2 more days they had waited. Then, a morning had come when the rain stopped and a weak, watery sun had appeared, filtered through a high gray haze. A fitful wind had stirred from the west. "Get the sickle bar," his father had said. "We're cutting." Silas had been aghast. but it's supposed to rain again tomorrow. It'll never cure." His father had stopped and looked at him then, a direct, steady gaze that Silas had never forgotten. "We're not going to dry it, son," he had said. "We're going to cure it." That was when his father had told him the principle, the core of the knowledge that had been passed down from his own father, who had learned it in the old country. "The problem ain't the water in the hay," Abram had explained, his voice patient. "The problem is the life that grows in that water. The mold, the rot. That's what makes the heat. You can fight the water and lose. Or you can fight the life." He had taken Silas to the small, tight-sided shed behind the barn. Inside were dozens of heavy canvas bags, stacked neatly on a wooden platform. They were filled with coarse salt, the kind used for livestock. "Salt draws the water," his father had said, running a handful through his calloused fingers. "Everyone knows that, but they forget the other thing. Nothing bad can live in salt. It's a preservative. It keeps the life from starting. The hay will sweat in the barn, but it won't rot. It will cure, slow and proper from the inside out." The memory was as clear as the view from his porch. He could still feel the weight of the salt bags, still hear the rhythmic whir of the old fertilizer spreader they had used to lay a thin, even coat of salt on the damp windrows. He remembered the skepticism of their neighbors, the way they had stopped along the road to watch, shaking their heads. He remembered the unique, slightly heavy feel of the salted bales and the exacting way his father had insisted they be stacked in the barn, on edge, with air channels left between the rows, creating a chimney effect that would allow the moisture to escape. And he remembered the winter, when their hay had been green and sweet-smelling, while the neighbors who had rushed to bale in a brief sunny spell had opened bales full of gray mold and dust. The knowledge was not written in a book. It was etched into his memory, a physical thing, a series of movements and smells and sounds. It was the weight of a salt bag, the grit of the crystals on his hands, the specific, briny sweet scent of a curing bale. It was a truth he had carried with him for more than 30 years, waiting for a summer just like this one. The next morning, the rain had lessened to a drizzle. The forecast on the radio spoke of a possible break, a day, maybe two, of cloudy but dry weather before the next system moved in. It was not the 3-day window of sunshine that convention demanded. But for Silas, it was the window his father had spoken of. It was the one he would get. He did not go to the co-op. He did not consult a chart. He went to his workshop, a long, low building filled with the tools and spare parts of a lifetime of self-reliance. He opened the doors, and the smell of grease, old iron, and damp earth filled the air. His primary tool was not a modern marvel of engineering. It was a 1953 Ford Jubilee tractor. He had bought it used in 1960, and he knew its every quirk and preference. The paint was faded to a soft gray and rust, but the engine was clean. He checked the oil, the fluid levels, the tension of the fan belt. He ran a file over the points in the distributor, setting the gap with a practiced eye. The tractor started on the second try, settling into a low, even rumble that was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He then turned his attention to the mower. It was not a modern disc bind that shredded the hay as it cut, but an old, 7-foot sickle bar mower. Its design was a century old. He spent an hour sharpening the triangular blades, section by section, with a hand file, until each one had a keen, silver edge. He greased the pitman arm and the joints, his movements slow and deliberate. The final piece of equipment he prepared was the one that would have baffled Mark Renshaw the most. It was an old broadcast spreader, the kind once used for granular fertilizer. Years ago, Silas had modified it. He had narrowed the output, creating a mechanism that would drop the material in a controlled band about 3 feet wide, rather than flinging it across a 20-foot arc. He had cleaned and oiled it after its last use, 33 years ago, and it was still in perfect working order. He hitched it to the back of the Jubilee and drove it to the small, windowless shed behind the barn. He pulled open the heavy wooden door. The salt was there, just as he remembered. Heavy, 100-pound canvas sacks of coarse rock salt, stacked on a raised pallet of oak planks his father had laid down to keep the damp from the floor. The air in the shed was dry and cool, with the faint, clean scent of a salt lick. He hefted one of the bags onto his shoulder. The weight was familiar, a solid, grounding presence. With his preparations made, Silas acted. He drove the Jubilee, the sickle bar hitched and ready, to the largest of his bottom fields. The ground was soft, but not mud. The old tractor's narrow tires pressed into the soil, but did not mire. He set the throttle to a steady pace and lowered the sickle bar. The clatter of the blades slicing through the thick, wet grass was a sharp, mechanical rhythm against the quiet morning. He worked in a pattern, moving from the outside of the field inward, the cut hay falling in a neat, green swath behind him. He did not rush. He watched the cutter bar, listening to the engine, feeling the pull of the heavy grass. He stopped twice to clear clumps of wet clover that threatened to choke the mechanism. By midday, the entire 40-acre field was cut. The air was filled with the sweet, heavy scent of freshly mown alfalfa and grass, a smell of promise tinged with the dampness of the earth. Henderson, his neighbor, stopped his truck on the road that ran alongside the field. He leaned out the window. "Silas, what in the world are you doing?" he shouted over the tractor's engine. "You'll never get that to dry. It's gonna rain again tonight." Silas throttled down the Jubilee and looked over. "Just cutting," he said. "You're gonna lose it all," Henderson said, shaking his head. It was not a judgment, but a statement of what he believed to be undeniable fact. "It'll just lay there and rot." Silas gave a simple nod. "Might," he said, and throttled the tractor back up, leaving Henderson staring after him in disbelief. The news spread quickly. By the time Silas was finishing the second field, cars were slowing on the road. The men from the co-op drove by, pointing. They saw it not as an act of farming, but as an act of folly. Old Man Blackwood had finally lost his senses. The next day, the sky remained a high, unbroken sheet of gray. The promised rain had not arrived, but neither had the sun. A weak breeze stirred the cut hay. Silas hitched his side delivery rake to the Jubilee. He drove carefully through the fields, the spinning tines of the rake lifting the damp hay and turning it over, fluffing it into long, loose rows called windrows. This was a critical step. It allowed the air to move through the hay, to begin the slow process of drawing the moisture out. He raked the fields twice that day, once in the morning and once in the late afternoon. He did not use a moisture meter. He used his hands. He would stop the tractor, walk to a windrow, and grab a handful of the hay. He would twist it, feeling the resistance in the stems. He would smell it, checking for the first hint of sourness that would signal the beginning of decay. By the end of the day, the hay was not dry. By Renshaw's standards, it was still dangerously wet, probably at 30% moisture or more. But to Silas, it felt right. It had lost the slick, waterlogged feel of the first day. It was now just deeply, thoroughly damp. On the third morning, the air was thick and still. The clouds were lower. The radio confirmed his senses. The next band of rain would arrive by evening. This was his last chance. This was the window. He drove the Jubilee, now pulling the modified spreader, to the shed and loaded it with salt from the canvas bags. He drove to the fields and began the process his father had taught him. He drove slowly, straddling each windrow, the spreader dropping a fine, even layer of coarse salt crystals over the damp, gray-green hay. The white salt stood out against the darker vegetation. From the road, it looked as if he were salting the earth, a strange and pointless ritual. Mark Renshaw chose that morning to do his rounds. He was driving his county truck, making notes on a clipboard about which farmers had bought the chemical preservative and which had not. He saw Silas in the field and pulled over, his face a mixture of pity and professional exasperation. He got out of his truck and walked to the fence line. "Mr. Blackwood," he called out. Silas stopped the tractor and waited. Renshaw walked toward him, his clean boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. "What are you doing?" Renshaw asked, gesturing at the salted windrow. His tone was that of a teacher questioning a student who had given a nonsensical answer. "Salting the hay," Silas said, his voice flat. "Why?" Renshaw asked, genuinely perplexed. "What do you think that's going to accomplish?" "It's for the cure," Silas replied. Renshaw stared for a moment. Then a look of dawning comprehension crossed his face, followed by a faint, suppressed smile. "Oh, I see," he said, his voice laced with condescension. It's an old folk remedy. To draw out the moisture, right? Mr. Blackwood, I mean this with all due respect, but that's not going to work. The amount of salt you need to actually dry this much hay. You'd have to use tons of it. You're just wasting your time and money. And you're adding salt to your feed, which isn't good for your cattle in these quantities. Silas looked at the young man. He saw the certainty in his eyes, the absolute faith in the things he had learned from books. He saw no reason to argue. I thank you for your concern, he said. He put the tractor back in gear. Renshaw, dismissed, stood for a moment, then walked back to his truck, shaking his head. He made a note on his clipboard. S. Blackwood, total loss of first cutting due to refusal to adopt modern methods. Attempting folk remedy, salting. Advise monitoring for financial distress. He drove away feeling a pang of sadness for the old man, a stubborn relic in a world that had passed him by. With the salting done, Silas switched to the final piece of equipment, his New Holland 68 baler. It was a machine from the 1960s, a simple, rugged piece of engineering that he knew intimately. He had replaced its knotters twice and its plunger bearings once. He could diagnose its ailments by sound alone. He hitched it to the Jubilee and began the final pass through the fields. The baler's pickup tines lifted the salted hay from the windrow and fed it into the chamber. The plunger arm rocked back and forth with a steady, rhythmic thump, compressing the hay into tight, rectangular blocks. Every few seconds, the needles would cycle. The intricate mechanical hands of the knotters would tie a perfect knot with twine, and another bale would slide down the chute. The bales were heavy, heavier than dry bales would be, dense with the remaining moisture. He could feel the extra strain on the tractor's engine. He had a young neighbor, Ben, the 16-year-old son of a farmer on the next road over, helping him. Ben drove a flatbed wagon alongside the baler, and Silas used his arms and a hay hook to swing the bales from the chute onto the wagon, where Ben stacked them. The boy was quiet and worked hard. "This hay feels damp, Mr. Blackwood," Ben said, his brow furrowed with worry. He had heard the talk at the co-op. "It's supposed to," Silas said, and that was all. They worked all day, under the darkening sky. The air grew thick and smelled of rain. They filled one wagon, hauled it to the barn, and went back for another. They cleared the first field, then the second. The last bale was made just as the first drops of the new storm began to fall. They were fat, heavy drops that splattered in the dust. By the time they had the last wagon under the cover of the barn, the drizzle had become a steady downpour. The sound of the rain on the tin roof was a loud, drumming roar. Now came the final, most crucial part of the process. Stacking the hay. Anyone could make a pile, but Silas was building a cure. The barn was an old structure, built with mortise and tenon joints, the timbers dark and smooth with age. It was designed to breathe. Gaps between the siding boards allowed for constant air circulation. Silas directed Ben with few words. "On edge," he would say, or "leave a hand's width." They did not stack the bales flat and tight, as one would with dry hay. They stood each bale on its narrow edge, so the twine was on the sides, not the top and bottom. This allowed the moisture to rise more easily through the cut stems of the grass. They built the stack in sections, leaving a 6-inch air channel between each row of bales. Every 4 layers, they laid a row of bales crosswise, which stabilized the stack and created horizontal air passages. They were not just stacking feed. They were engineering a complex system of ventilation, a giant, passive lung that would allow the hay to slowly exhale its moisture over the coming weeks. It was hard, hot work. The air in the barn was humid, and the salt on the bales stung the cuts on their hands. They worked until well after dark, by the light of a single, bare bulb hanging from a rafter. When they were finished, the hay was not in one solid mass, but in a series of tall, freestanding pillars, with a central chimney-like opening left in the middle of the entire stack. "It has to breathe," Silas said to Ben, who was looking at their work with a puzzled expression. "Like a living thing." The rain continued for another week. The humidity was oppressive. In barns across the county, the story Renshaw had predicted began to play out. The men who had rushed to bale in the brief dry spells, without using the expensive preservatives, found their barns filled with the sour, musty smell of mold. Henderson went to check his stack and found the bales were warm to the touch. He had to hire 2 men to help him pull the entire stack apart, dragging the steaming, ruined bales out into the rain to rot. The financial loss was devastating. Even some of the men who had used the chemical agent were having problems. They had baled too wet, trusting the technology too much, and the chemicals had not been enough. There was talk of a barn over in the next county that had caught fire, the family losing not only their hay, but their herd of dairy cows as well. The county was gripped by a quiet panic. Silas's barn was different. For the first few days, a faint steam rose from the stacks of hay. The air inside was warm and humid, but it did not smell sour. It smelled clean like the sea. A briny, sweet scent filled the cavernous space. Silas checked the stack every morning and every evening. He would place his hand on the bales. They were warm, but it was a gentle, even warmth, not the alarming, concentrated heat of decomposition. He would reach deep into the air channels, feeling the air move. A slow but steady current was rising through the stacks, carrying the moisture with it. The salt was doing its work. It was absorbing the moisture from the plant fibers, creating a hypersaline environment where mold spores and bacteria could not multiply. The hay was not rotting. It was sweating. It was curing. Mark Renshaw was having a difficult month. His office was inundated with calls from desperate farmers. His confident solutions had proven to be fallible. The chemical preservatives worked, but only within a narrow margin of error that many farmers, in their haste, had exceeded. His spreadsheets had not accounted for the sheer, unrelenting persistence of the rain. He drove the county roads, his clipboard now a catalog of failures. He saw Henderson's blackened, rotting pile of hay and felt a knot of guilt in his stomach. One afternoon, his route took him past Silas Blackwood's farm. He slowed down, expecting to see a similar scene of ruin, perhaps the old man sadly forking rotten bales out of his barn. Instead, all was quiet. The barn doors were open to the damp air. Out of a mixture of professional duty and morbid curiosity, Renshaw pulled into the long gravel driveway. He got out of his truck. He did not smell rot. He smelled something else, something clean and strange. He walked toward the barn, feeling like a trespasser. Silas was inside, sitting on an overturned bucket, cleaning a piece of machinery. He looked up as Renshaw approached, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Blackwood," Renshaw said, his voice hesitant. "I was just passing by, checking on folks." "Afternoon," Silas said, not stopping his work. How's the hay?" Renshaw asked, gesturing toward the massive, carefully arranged stacks. He expected a confession of failure, a request for advice on how to dispose of the mess. "Curing," Silas said. Renshaw stepped closer. He put his hand on the nearest bale, just as Silas had done. It was firm and cool to the touch on the outside. The air flowing from the channels between the stacks was slightly damp, but it smelled sweet. It smelled like good hay. He was mystified. According to everything he had learned, this entire barn should have been a smoldering, mold-infested disaster. "I don't understand," he said, half to himself. "This shouldn't be possible." Silas finally set down his wrench and looked at the young man. "Some things are," he said. The final proof came in September. The rains had finally broken, and a long, beautiful autumn had settled over the land. The second cutting of hay had been successful for everyone, but it was not enough to make up for the losses of the first. There was a shortage of good hay in the county, and the price had doubled. Henderson, having lost his entire first cutting and gotten only a meager second, was facing a hard winter. He would have to sell off half his herd. One Saturday, his pride swallowed, he drove his truck up Silas's driveway. "Silas," he began, not meeting the old man's eyes. "I know this is a long shot, but I need hay. I need it bad. I can pay. I'll pay whatever you're asking." Silas led him into the barn. The air inside was now dry and cool, and the sweet, rich scent of well-cured hay filled the space. The stacks stood as they had been built, solid and stable. Silas climbed onto one of the stacks, a hay hook in his hand. He sank the hook into a bale from the middle of the pile and pulled it free. He dropped it to the barn floor. Then he took his pocket knife, cut the 2 lengths of twine, and pulled the bale apart. Henderson and Renshaw, who had happened to be visiting Silas, trying to document the process, leaned in to look. The hay inside was not brown or gray. It was a soft, pale green. It was leafy and pliable. It smelled wonderful like a summer field. Tiny white crystals of salt were visible, clinging to the stems, but there was not a speck of mold, not a trace of dust or decay. It was perfect hay. Silas picked up a handful and offered to Henderson. Henderson looked at it, then at Silas, his face a mask of disbelief and wonder. "I'll be damned," he whispered. To prove the final point, Silas walked to the barn door and gave a low call. His 24 beef cattle, grazing in the nearby pasture, looked up. He tossed a flake of the salted hay onto the ground outside. A large Hereford cow ambled over, sniffed the hay curiously, and then began to eat it with relish. The other cows followed, jostling for a position. They loved it. The salt, far from being a deterrent, was an attractant. Henderson bought 20 tons of hay from Silas that day, enough to get his herd through the winter. He paid the full, inflated market price without a word of complaint. As he was loading the last bale, he turned to Silas. "You knew," he said. "All this time you knew. We were all laughing, and you knew." Silas just nodded. "My father taught me," he said. After Henderson left, Renshaw remained. The young agent had his notebook out, but he wasn't writing. He seemed to be in a state of shock. He had witnessed the complete refutation of his formal education. He finally looked up from the perfect green hay on the floor. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out quietly, with difficulty. "I came here thinking I could teach you something. I dismissed you. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. My books, my training, none of it accounted for this." Silas sat back down on his overturned bucket. He looked at the young man and saw not the arrogant agent from the co-op, but a boy who was ready to learn. "The books are fine," Silas said, his voice gentle. "They tell you what things are. They don't always tell you how they work. Not here. Not on this piece of ground." He then began to explain, simply and without any sense of triumph. He told Renshaw about his father, about the principle of fighting the life, not the water. He explained why the hay had to be cut at a certain stage, why it had to be damp but not soaking. He described the precise amount of salt needed, about 20 pounds per ton of hay, a ratio learned through generations of trial and error. It was just enough to halt the microbial growth, but not so much as to harm the cattle. In fact, it provided them with necessary minerals. He walked Renshaw through the stacking process, explaining the physics of the air channels, the chimney effect, the slow, patient exhalation of moisture over weeks and months. "It's a slow cure," Silas finished, "not a fast dry. You can't rush it. You have to give it time. You have to trust the salt and the air." Ben, the young neighbor, had come by to help with some chores, and he stood listening, absorbing every word. He looked from the hay to Silas to the humbled county agent, and a deep understanding settled in his eyes. Renshaw did not write on a spreadsheet. He filled his small, spiral-bound notebook with careful, handwritten notes and diagrams. He came back every week for a month, asking questions, measuring the moisture content of the remaining bales, documenting the process with the meticulousness of a convert. He sent samples of the hay to the university lab for nutritional analysis. The results came back confirming what Silas's cows already knew. The protein and nutrient levels were exceptionally high, better than most conventionally dried hay, because the gentle curing process had preserved the delicate leaves of the alfalfa and clover, where the most nutrition was stored. The next spring, the County Extension Service published a new pamphlet. It was titled Alternative Forage Preservation Techniques for High Humidity Conditions. It detailed, in dry, scientific language, the method of curing damp hay with salt. It included diagrams of stacking patterns and charts of salt-to-tonnage ratios. It did not mention folk remedies. It called the method osmotic preservation and passive aeration. At the bottom of the second page, in small print, was a single line. This technique was documented and refined in cooperation with Silas Blackwood, a multi-generational farmer in the Piedmont region. The knowledge had been translated. It had been adopted. The old Jubilee tractor sat in its shed, its engine cool. It was more than a machine. It was a symbol of a particular kind of wisdom, the wisdom of maintenance over replacement, of understanding over novelty. It did not have the horsepower of the new tractors, but it was reliable. It was paid for, and it was perfectly suited to the tasks it was asked to perform. Like its owner, it was a testament to the idea that some things do not become obsolete. They simply wait for the world to remember their value. The story of Silas's salted hay became the new reality in that corner of the county. The laughter at the co-op had long since faded, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. Farmers would now stop Silas not to mock him, but to ask his opinion on the weather, on the soil, on the timing of a planting. He had not changed at all, but the world around him had tilted, just slightly, to align with his perspective. His success was no longer a strange anomaly. It was simply a fact, as solid and dependable as the fieldstone foundation of his house. It was the new, old wisdom. One afternoon, Silas saw young Ben in the field, walking the windrows of his own family's hay. The boy was not using a fancy digital meter. He was kneeling, picking up a handful of hay, twisting in his hands, smelling it. He was learning to read the language of the crop itself. Silas watched him for a long time. He saw the boy's focus, the quiet intensity of his observation. He saw a chain of knowledge being forged, a link between his father's generation and the next. Later, when Ben came over to ask a question about the salt, Silas did not just give him an answer. He took him to the small shed, showed him the remaining bags from 1948, and gave him the small, leather-bound ledger where his own father had made notes on rainfall and salt ratios from years long past. "It's not about the salt," Silas told the boy. "It's about paying attention." Ben took the book with a reverence that told Silas the knowledge was in safe hands. The world was full of new things, of faster and more powerful ways to get a job done. But the rain was not new, and the nature of hay was not new, and the properties of salt were ancient. Silas knew that the land held the answers, but did not shout them. It whispered. The solutions were not always in a catalog or a scientific journal. Sometimes they were stored in the quiet memory of a man who had learned to listen, in a method that waited patiently for the right kind of problem, in the simple, enduring truth of a handful of salt. Some things did not need to be reinvented. They just needed to be remembered.